get the materiality of that infrastructure. And basically that, there are a very limited number of power players in control of those pipelines that at a moment's notice, if that's considered protest and activism, can shut the thing down or propagandize it or put misinformation in the thing. And I wonder if that ever kind of comes up as like, this is still kind of a material avenue where there are kind of not necessarily benevolent players like in charge of the thing.
In terms of who produced the video itself?
No, well, possibly the content, but also just the management of traffic if it becomes kind of politically destabilizing.
I would say not, that's a good question, on the traffic part, not as much, but there is a sense of, after watching it a year ago, those who fully watched it, and watching it, or thinking about it now, there was a sense of feeling, a awareness of feeling a bit manipulated in terms of particularly how the little boy's name's Gavin. And I fast forward through the part about Jacob, but Gavin is connected to Jacob, and one of the points the author, or the producer, the guy who's narrating the video says is, if this was happening here to this kid, we would stop. It wouldn't even be an issue. Because it's happening far away to kids in Uganda, nobody cares. So there's a sense of feeling a bit manipulated in the way the message was conveyed, but still not a sense of, I don't think that there was much of a sense of, I didn't ask, about the notion of if there's the power in terms of trafficking, getting the message out online.
Right. Did issues of national sovereignty ever come up in these debates at all?
No, that was the other
Which
thing.
is
I
kind of
didn't
odd.
get a choice to mention that if you think about being in Uganda, okay, well, where is Uganda? Which is the other part that I thought because some people did donate money to it, some of the kids did, but still had no clear sense of, one, where their money was going, what that money was doing, and still really couldn't identify where Uganda was.
And whether we have authority to do anything there.
Well, there was a piece in the clip where they show Obama showing, signing some legislation that he committed troops to go. But I do think there's a disconnect between we sent troops over there to that's where the story ends. Because a lot of them didn't realize Kony still has not been found caught, despite their whatever action they thought they did. That's what I tried.
Okay, I tend to trip over my words, so have patience with me. All right, so I want to go back, Brett, to you talked about off-use labels, off-label use. I want to go back to this on-label use, actually, just to talk about, and I want to bring up some words that neuronormativity. I've never heard that word before, but I love it. Right? And then what was it that you used? That human deficiency. So I guess I want to come back to this idea of difference and this whole idea of a whether we call it a gender organization or a race organization or a neuro whatever dominant organization, right? So whatever gets us through this organization, this institution, the easiest. And if you're not that basic average normal, then it's harder to get through, and in this case, the educational institution. It's just more difficult. But is that really a human deficiency? How do we define that? And how much of that is part of that dominant culture again? So,
yeah. Right. So to perhaps to back up a little bit and to address probably these themes of defining what is, I mean, it's the norm. What is the norm, right? By which is the, symptoms, right? Like, the displaying of symptoms that don't, so of the therapeutic versus the enhancement, these kind of tensions are so on the one sense, to get into the kind of narrative of the medical, right, that those who are suffering symptoms, right, that using the, existing, right, I guess like current, right, that using psychopharmaceuticals to treat, manage kind of symptoms, say, of attention deficit disorder or something like that, right, that to equivalent, right, like it makes them more, quotes, normal, right, those conditions of normativity as defined, say, of, right, a very kind of disciplined, right, within a classroom, right, very kind of socially, right, kind of constructed, right, expectations of proper, proper, like, action and, right, so, So there is this kind of a sense of cognitive psychopharmaceuticals as, you know, making those with deficient make norm. There's on the other flip, right? So it like brings equality in some sense, right? So some dimension. But then on the other side, the off-label use. Is that what you were interested in? Was the off-label or the on-label?
Well, I mean, kind of both. I mean, we've talked about in so many different ways, you know, do we really want equality, or do we want difference, or do we want some sort of something that includes all of it? You know, and the same thing, okay, so if we're talking about, we want people to be able to fit in this organization, so we want them to be equal, so we're going to bring them up to this level through pharmacology, right? So I think some of that's going on. I think there's a bunch of different things going on. But then you use the off-label and go, okay, not only is there normal, there's just super normal. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I would also say that perhaps a lot of this off-label use is right. People do feel that they need, right? They don't perhaps see it as enhancing, but as perhaps as you know, this is speculation, right? Right, like that. Yeah, there perhaps is a sense of need of using these to achieve perhaps some imagined kind of like idealization or something. Right? Yeah, I don't know.
Do you still have a question?
Yeah, I do. It's Cerise. Okay, so I'm also very interested in student engagement, student activism, this sort of student social movements. But a lot of the literature, you know, suggests a certain kind of involvement, a certain kind of activism. And I've also found in my research that students are describing involvement and activism in sort of a different way than traditional activist research has previously suggested. And so I'm kind of wondering what you think your study about Kony 2012 is suggesting about student involvement, and how that, if there's a change in what it means, or if you think students are engaging sort of different principles about involvement. I guess what kind of implications do you think there might be?
In terms of what the students think they're doing?
Yeah, what they think they're doing, because I think a lot of the research, you know, a lot of engagement research suggests a very specific kind of student activism, is student involvement, and I found the same sorts of things that you found. Students think they're involved in, you know, an activist because they created a Facebook page. And by all accounts, you know, activist literature, student engagement literature would suggest no way.
Right.
And so I'm curious what you kind of make of that, what you think is happening. And are we seeing sort of a change in what activism means and what involvement means, and maybe what potential consequences there may be, or if you don't see any at all?
I do think there's been some interesting shifts and changes, particularly from the way that what people think the use of media does to better or generate awareness, because arguably it does generate awareness much quicker than traditional means of if you were calling people or did a newsletter or whatnot. Yeah, what I think is interesting is the significance of that action is what I think is different. Whereas historically, and I'm not sure about the historical literature, so I don't have that as a comparison point, but from what I've read and understood, there's a sense of continual engagement, particularly from talking with my parents who were involved, or my mother, involved in a certain set. It wasn't just, I did this one thing, cover the night. This is something I do every Saturday. This sit-in happens repeatedly. This is an engagement that does not stop. And it's also something that happens across different organizations. It's something that you did in school, something you did in church, and found different ways to connect. What I find interesting is there's not that engagement. I find the dialogue part, it's just not generating or fostering the dialogue with peers or families or anything. It's literally, I clicked on this and sent it to my friends. And it's this one stop of, I did the April event and I did the Facebook account, I'm done, and I've done my activist. It's not activist in terms of an embodiment, but activist is this one-time performance.
I think it's very interesting.
Dr. Cloud, and then we'll come up to Allison and then Alex.
Okay, first of all, everybody should come again, well, that's fine. I have a comment related to both papers, which is about the need in any kind of literacy, I think, when you started to get to that, in historical and structural contextualization, because the way that Kony 2012 paints the crisis, it's like this one guy, and he's bad,
Yeah.
right? And you don't understand about the history of the conflict there, you don't understand about the history of imperialism there that pit groups against one another, and you don't understand the selectivity of U.S. And the public's prosecution of dictators, very selective. So Suharto, James Clinton, and anyone who's a Muslim, though, forget it. So that's an element of this picture, too. And so atrocity needs contextualization, and you'll find out things that, you know, that you're not going to know on the History Channel. You know, when you see the anti-Hitler documentary, you don't know that the U.S. turned away boatloads of refugees from Europe. I mean, you don't know that the economic crisis was sort of at the root of the rise of fascism, in my humble opinion. So, so that there are things that you don't know in terms of context, and so that's what makes the activism kind of shallow. It's not just the form of it, it's not just the virtuality of it. It's the depth of knowledge. And I think the same thing applies to pharmaceutical enhancements, of which I'm very serious beneficiary. But it's Emily Martin has this great work about mental illness and the history of capitalism, where she talks about how, I mean, depression starts to get diagnosed in 1921 because workers were so depressed and exhausted. They were so exhausted that they were no longer high functioning at work. And capitalism really did require laborers who were on the ball, fast-paced, didn't complain, right? But now we also need a bunch of consumers who are extremely fast-paced. I mean, cocaine is very adaptive to our society, and so is Adderall, so is Ritalin. And Emily Martin is fantastic at contextualizing expectations and imperatives of neoliberalism for what counts as neurologically normal. She's also really good at saying, I'm an anthropologist and my critique is this, but in my regular life, I'm diagnosed with bipolar disorder and I have to take these medications or else I'm not going to survive in the society as it exists. And so I think it's important to be careful about bringing that particular critique into practice.
I didn't get a chance to go into this. I'm glad you brought it up. I talked to somebody earlier about that very thing, about the contextualization piece, because one of the moves that the video makes, if you watch all the way through, it takes an issue that's not necessarily a Western American issue, but re-articulates it through Western mythos and the types of values that you see in America, particularly this notion of there is a good guy, there's a bad guy. This notion that, you know, even how they frame age and youth can overtake, you know, so you do see like the democracy in this, it is overly simplified as totalitarianism, without really explaining what that means, how that happens, how we got into power, but it taps into American ideals of this, so it's framed in a way that removes a lot of that context and makes it resonate with this American ideas. And it really is, it's clever, it's creepy, but clever. How they use that, there's a birth video in there too, and they use this little boy, and he talks about Jacob. Jacob tells the story, then Jacob grows up and comes to the States. And there's like, even there's this journey, this myth of if I come to the U.S., everything's better. But even if we liberate these kids, what does that even mean? Because every Jacob can't come here.
So, thanks for these papers, and once again, I'm drawn to the connections between them. And to build off of this idea of context, what I'm really interested in, because I had the privilege of teaching a class, we were literally in the middle of our section on critiquing American humanitarian interventionism when the Kony video went viral. And I was like, thank you for this experience. And the students were very critical. Having read the literature that we had read about humanitarian intervention, they had the same questions, Chris, that you were pointing to about what rights do we have to intervene. But what I see in both of these cases is students trying to change something, right? And trying to enact an agency. And what I'm curious, and I know that there are undergraduate students in here, so please correct us when we start saying that you're doing things that you maybe aren't doing. What I'm curious about is how have our understandings of the spaces that we can change altered, and why? So that social media as a one-time event, taking a pill to make us be able to remember more things, and I think what you're pointing to, Dr. Dana, is the material, Dr. Dana. I feel like I need to write you a letter, dear Dr. Dana. But what are the material and social changes that have produced these quote-unquote easy fixes, although anyone who's taken a drug that changes your brain, it's not so freaking easy, right? Like, these one-time fixes, why is that the mode of agency that we're looking at right now? Any ideas?
I mean, you can go to like as a way to provide some contextualization, kind of engage in kind of these like narratives of medicalization, right? The you know, kind of growing encroachment of medicalization, right? The you know, the enframing of kind of social, right, like solutions and kind of medical terms or something like that, right? So that would be an interesting dimension to engage, I guess, for some, as a part of.
And it seems in terms of the activism piece, it might not necessarily be a one-time engagement, right? Like, because as you said, when they were done, they didn't know what happened to Joseph Kony because they perhaps were on to the next, you know.
Bring up that, didn't say it was up enough time to show the Invisible Children's website. They continually updated that website, and they're actually thinking about putting out a new video. But for whatever reason, space, place, interest, they moved on. There's not that same interest in making it go viral or even in them sustaining that involvement. So the organization itself has tried.
Right.
But it just got framed as this one-time event, and if you cover the night or get your action kit, you've done your part.
See, at UNC, I was really intrigued. We didn't even, I know so many students who were interested, and then the scandal happened, the critiques in the media happened about the economic status of the organization. We did not get plastered, right? I was expecting it. I was expecting to cover the night, but there was like one Kony 2012 sidewalk chalk that night. And I'm curious about UNCG.
Is it that they cover the night?
Yeah.
No.
All right, we have Alex, Jessica, and then Dr. Dempsey, or Sarah, or Dr. Sarah.
One thing that I thought was sort of interesting about this, like this one-time activism, do you think this has sort of anything to do with sort of this dialectic between guilt and absolution, that you know, when you see all of your friends doing something and you're the only one who's not doing it? This was sort of the anxiety I felt on Facebook a few days ago with the equal sign. That, you know, I had some deep problems with the HRC, their approach, but there was still this nagging guilt that if I don't do that, I'm the homophobe out of my friends, or I'm the person who's not taking activism. So do you think this idea that I don't do it, so all of my friends think that of me and I can absolve myself of that guilt merely by posting has anything to do with some of the problems of the non-durability of that activism?
That's an interesting question. I do think I could see that being a factor in engaging that, but I could see that being part of this notion of almost like how social proof works when my friends are doing it, and if I don't, then I look a certain way. But I remember when I saw the other signs on Facebook as well, and I'm one of those people that I'm not a faddish person, because by the time I look at something, I have to research it before I put that symbol out there, then the moment has passed. So I'm the same way with you. It's like I do want to be a part of something, but at the same time, what am I being a part of? What we look into before going, then your 5 minutes is up. But that could be an interesting piece about, especially if it goes viral and people really feel a sense of engagement. That could be more just engagement and connection. It could be if all my friends are identifying this is what we're supposed to do. Then if I don't, I may look like I don't care. I may look like I'm not the activist.
Jessica.
Brett, I think there's something also in the medicalized discourse that whether or not you frame it as an enhancement or a deficiency, there's a reticence that gets back to that humanness that you were talking about at the beginning, right? And that's the human element of, oh, I can do it without the enhancement, or I can overcome my deficiency. So either way that it's framed, I think that you can get back to that humanness as well in terms of a pushback towards our cognitive enhancements and reverting back to our humanness and saying, I don't need that augmentation, or I do not have that deficiency, or I can overcome it either way. And so I'm curious if you've seen that kind of resilience. I think it happens in medicalized rhetoric if you look at depression research or hormonal imbalances, any of the type of corrective medications that are out there. There seems to be that return to naturalness.
Yeah, I haven't. So what I was looking at was these kind of like circulating, kind of more popular kind of articles. But no, in those, it was like the concern of over-prescription or like that's, that's very, very interesting, right? The kind of reclaiming of, quote, some essential, right, as like a kind of resistant, right? That to which I tried to problematize, like even at the very beginning, right? As something to kind of think about as kind of the, you know, the ways that thinking about use of drugs broadly make us uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, resurgence of homeopathy and things like that as a backlash to medicalized drugs.
Sarah?
My comment / question is in conversation with Stevie, your question, is that right, Stevie?
Yeah.
Okay, your question about, thinking about the Kony 2012 campaign and kind of extrapolating to say, what are the implications if this is a prominent mode of engagement, right? And people are occupied in relationship to issues of equality, difference, in terms of a model for addressing social change. And then Allison, your question of how is this possible? How are these modes of engagement and their offerings even sensible, right? How do they make sense? What are the mechanisms through which they have strength and validity? And my response to that and question to Cerise is to what extent do we see this convergence of two dominant ways in which we think about social change right now in the contemporary context? The one is the status of reflexive capitalism, right, in which we have the marketing of rebellion, right, this idea that resistance is cool and has become, actively used in advertising campaigns. It has social cachet, right, but it's a very prescribed model of rebellion, right, and that model of rebellion does not address at a fundamental level the systems of inequalities, right? And at the same time that you have that, the marketing of cool, right, that people have been talking about for a long time, the reflexivity of capitalism, right, and how it kind of swallows up different types of resistance, you have the marketization of the nonprofit sector happening, in which, right, so KFC buckets for the cure. Right? Can't get over, I'm sorry. It's this idea that you're going to buy a bucket of fried chicken and you're going to help raise money for the Susan Komen Foundation to do research on the causes of cancer, right? And so thinking about that, what is the position, the subject to be offered within this framework of the marketization of the nonprofit sector? We have the model of the social entrepreneur. That is the embodiment of the logic of the market in addressing social problems. So both of these forces are coming together at this particular moment, and they don't provide a lot of opportunities to challenge the systems that are in place. So to what extent do you see perhaps those two kind of influences in the student reflections about their involvement, right? So the reflexive capitalism, how cool rebellion is, but a particular type of rebellion, and then the kind of idea of the social entrepreneur.
I'm unpacking the question in my head as you're talking. The market, are you asking about how, in terms of the marketizing of, like the whole buy chicken for the cure type thing, how that may work with the sense of, that's an interesting question about the kid. The rebellion point, I think marketing cool may, culturally by age and by some other cultural factors, may not be the same across all groups. I don't think you can necessarily market cool the same way. Because I would argue some of the students I have would not identify with commodification of coolness or rebellion, but rebellion being something that does move outside of the spaces of capitalism. And that could just be from, I'm still thinking about the nonprofit part, yeah, the chicken for the cure. I'm still stuck on that. And that would be, I'm thinking how we does that, yeah.
It's easy to get stuck on, for sure. I think we have time for one more question. And
I'm gonna marry on that.
Marinate the chicken.
Our mom.
Well, you can go to somebody else because pretty much my question was what Sarah just asked.
Okay.
So.
All right, I think Paul has had his hand up for a while.
This is more of an observation than a question, but it finally floated to the top of my brain. I haven't had any performance enhancing drugs, that alteration of consciousness now, sort of in this particular zeitgeist, is about efficiency of performance in competitive situations. And back in the old days, when some of us were older or younger, it wasn't about that at all. It was about alternative ways of imagining being or having experience or something that was ultimately lyric. That was his motivation, is that are there other ways of experiencing consciousness?
Well, that's,
Yeah, but you had jobs you could get.
Well, and I mean, she's right, the pie was not shrinking. You know, so the stakes weren't as high to perform cognitive needs.
well, let us continue to imagine together. Yes. Let's give our
Who brought the
panelists. Gentlemen,